This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers, on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions of software engineering topics at least once a month. SE Radio is brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine, online at computer.org/software.
For Software Engineering Radio, this is Robert Blumen. Today, I am joined by two guests, Alexander Budzier and Jürgen Laartz. Alexander is a researcher and instructor for the Executive Education Program at the Sa&iuml Business School, Oxford University, where he was also the co-director of the UK Government Project Leadership Program Pilot. He completed his doctoral studies at the Sa&iuml, studying the risk profile of more than 4,000 IT projects. Prior to his current position, he was a market research executive at T-Mobile and a consultant with McKinsey. He has published many research papers on areas including uncertainty in IT, mega projects, risk, and decision-making. Jürgen Laartz is a director with McKinsey & Company's Business Technology Office in Berlin, Germany, where he leads their global IT architecture practice. He serves clients in many industries, including telco, electronics, software, logistics, and financial services. Dr. Laartz holds a doctoral degree in physics from the University of Freiburg. He started a collaboration with Oxford's Sa&iuml Business School, which resulted in a study on failure of IT projects, which we will be discussing. Alex and Jürgen, welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Today, we will be discussing the failure of large IT projects. I'd like to start with how large is a large IT project?
So we actually see that size is something, particularly in IT projects, that is really difficult to judge. So for instance, if you're building a very large infrastructure thing, like a train station or a road or a bridge, then we would typically say that a large project is something that costs more than $1 billion. But because IT is really different in its nature, it's really difficult to judge and say, and it needs to be above that threshold to be large. So what we're seeing from sort of our research, what we really should be talking about is what are the problems in IT projects, or what is driving some of the difficulties of managing IT projects. And that is not size per se, but is two other things. Firstly, whether the project is going on for a very long time, so the time span, that kind of size. And secondly, it is whether the project is also transformative to the organization. So in that sense, not really would like to talk about large projects. I wouldn't call them large projects, but rather either very long projects or even better, transformative IT projects.
Yeah, I think to add to that, Alex, I think one of the real counterintuitive results of our joint project at the beginning was that we actually didn't find any discriminating factor whether a project is large in the classical sense or not. Yeah, because that was one of the key questions that we asked. Does size actually matter in terms of success rates or failure probability for IT projects? And we clearly found that is not the case. Yeah.
Which is also interesting because it is the dominant criteria to define your governance structure. So most organizations that we have worked with and most organizations that I've seen and know, they say, okay, if you're above that certain budget size, you report into this board. If you're above that budget size, you're seen as a higher risk and you report directly into the CIO or the XCOM. So, and it often governance structure is with the idea of managing the high risk project is cut by size or by budget size in particular. Yet we see that has really not a lot to do, or nothing to do actually, with the success chances and the risks of these projects.
I'd like to move on. How do we classify a project as a failure?
I think failure is a difficult attribute to use. Failure is something that is highly subjective. I think real failures in the way that projects are terminated is something I think that is undisputable. Yeah. But even if a project is terminated, in some cases, it just has to do with change in requirements. Yeah. So the question is what happens with projects. Yeah, a real failure in the end for an IT project is that it doesn't create the impact that was designed. Yeah, or that it should have delivered. Yeah, so that means that it doesn't support a business process, or that the underlying software doesn't deliver on the analytics, or whatever the task of the specific software was. Yeah, if that is not realized, then I think we have a real failure. But the factors that we are talking about, cost overruns and time overruns or business case non-deliverables, they are not necessarily linked to failures of projects. Yeah, they are linked to planning accuracies. They are linked to delivery capabilities in organizations. Yeah. So, question is whether then the failure in itself is the right category to look at. Yeah.
And to add to that, you could equally ask the questions: and what does constitute success? And so there's a great case example from it's not an IT project, but it's a project of the Norwegian Army, which built defense stations along the coast of Norway to defend against the invading Russian Navy, or the Soviet Navy, actually. And they built it in the late 1990s. And the project was delivered on time, on cost. It was delivered exactly with the scope prescribed, and it was exactly delivered to the quality that they wanted. And yet it went only into operations for about 6 months, because the threat wasn't there anymore. So the world had moved on. So even then, you can't really say, and was that project, I mean, sort of if you say, and we define project because it actually delivered the scope, the quality, on cost, and on schedule. So you wouldn't say that project was a success. It was a massive waste of taxpayer money. But it by sort of those narrow views of saying, that's a success, that's a failure, that would have counted as success. And as Jürgen just said, as in many other projects that struggle along and get finished and might see some changes in the baselines, those are equally not failures.
From my point of view, as an IT person, I would say if IT is delivered and it functions, that could still be a business failure, versus if it's never delivered, or it doesn't work, or it arrived not a week late, but a ridiculous amount of time later over budget. I would classify those differently. Is that a reasonable distinction?
I was saying, I think sort of, the real line in the sand, the red line, is if the project gets terminated and aborted and nothing ever goes live, and that happens according to some surveys, in 8 to 10% of all projects. And we also know that the key reason why projects get aborted is because they lost the support of the sponsorship. That's in 80% of the cases is the number one factor. They rarely struggle with technology. That only happens in about 30% of the cases. So it is because the world around it has moved on. And I think that links back to the other thing that Jürgen mentioned earlier, is in IT projects are there to deliver an outcome. And that's how they should be judged. So if that's late and the outcome was needed earlier and it goes to market a lot later, that's not ideal. But and if it was more expensive and you needed a lot more money to get to the outcome, again, that's not ideal. Yet I would not really always classify it as a failure.
Okay. Due to all the uncertainties about the future and changes that can occur in business, we would expect some projects will fail according to one or more of these criteria. Do you have a point of view on, are failure rates of these projects somehow too high or higher than necessary or maybe a large amount of avoidable failures occur?
I think with respect to failure, as Alex already has pointed out, as 80% of the terminated projects are terminated because the world has moved on. Yeah, that means they lost the support of their stakeholders, mainly because of changes in the business environment, yeah, or changes towards new organizational or process structures. Yeah, yeah. So the question is, I think the question is at least to 50% a question of business foresight in the way how requirements are voiced and written, and only to a lesser extent due to the technical delivery capability of IT organizations.
Alex, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, so from our survey, so we studied these 4,300 and something IT projects, and if we as we discussed before, we can't really say there's success and failure. However, what we can see is whether they were able to produce accurate estimates and were accurately planned. So whether the whole front end, and there's a lot of money that's being invested in that, and there's a whole lot of money that is and resources that are spent on governing and supervising these projects. And so the question is was that money wasted? And then we see sort of from our data that actually 5 out of 10 projects deliver on budget and deliver on time. But we also see that on average, for instance, for cost overruns, on average, they double their cost, and they're about 34% late. So, and that really begs the question is, sort of, what is the problem in IT? Because on the one hand, we see that the typical IT project, so every second IT project is just doing fine, and then there is the rest. So, what we really see as sort of the failure rate per se is not so much that there is a high rate of failure and a low rate of successes, but really that is these tail events that drive up that large average, despite a lot of projects delivering on time. And that's the true risk in IT. So in other words, it's not about the failure rate per se, but we really need to bring down the variability between different IT projects and the big differences of how they are faring. And that is the key point, not to say we need to improve the typical IT projects. It's about reducing the variability between those.
Since you bring that up, that ties in with a point I found very interesting. In reading about this topic, there is a particular catastrophic failure mode that you refer to as a black swan. Explain what that is, Alex.
Yes. So the metaphor is borrowed from Nicholas Taleb's book, which he published in 2007, I think, called The Black Swan, in which he discusses the history of humankind in some cases of where disruptive events have propelled us forward. And he then compares that to some financial instruments, some rare earth and some shares, and he goes into a critique of the financial markets, in particular traders who believe that they're in a very certain world, or they can actually model the risks out there, but they're in a world of wild randomness. And then sometimes massive losses occur, and those he calls black swan events. And interestingly, when we looked at our 4,000 projects, we found a very similar statistical signature that Taleb discovered in some financial markets that indicate these bubbles and these irrational decisions. We can see that same statistical signature in the cost performance and the schedule performance of IT projects. And that has sort of, and then we looked a little further into this, what these black swan things mean. And the metaphor that he borrows from is from an old text by John Stuart Mills, the philosopher of 1700s London, where he tells the story that in that period in time in London, there was a very famous saying that all swans are white. And then suddenly some Dutch explorers come back from Australia and bring back a pair of black swans. And suddenly, a fact that has been verified a gazillion times over the history of Europe is falsified by the existence of two singular birds. And sort of that is this kind of, it's a very small event with very big ripple effects. So nobody saw it coming before it happened. And afterwards, everybody is thinking, why the heck did we ever think that swans can only be white? Why can't they be all colors? So, and that's the interesting analogy that we see, that there are some of these small or seemingly small but high impact projects in a big portfolio of IT projects that create a lot of trouble, that cause a lot of disruption, and that in hindsight, they seem to make perfect sense. In foresight, most organizations didn't see them coming.
Jürgen, some of these examples I found quite spectacular. Do you recall any black swan examples that really make this point more concrete?
Yeah, I think I recall a lot of black swan examples. I just can't share them because because of the confidentiality of the consulting work, that is very, very, very difficult to do. Yeah, but I think a lot of very high-profile examples are out in the open and are published. Yeah, so if you look at Kmart, for example, or healthcare.gov and others, yeah. So I think these spectacular failures that make it to the press, I think is just the tip of the iceberg. That is what I can confirm. And we have done together actually portfolio reviews for companies. Yeah, so to look at their complete portfolio of IT projects, and there is not one company that doesn't have at least one or two black swans in their portfolio. Yeah, in the definition that Alex just gave. Yeah, so I think you will find those in every portfolio, in the way that with the definition that we used, that you have a fat tail distribution, first of all, for overruns, and that you secondly have projects where nobody thought that they could derail, and then out of a sudden it happened. Yeah. So this effect that in foresight the organizations weren't able to determine the risk candidates. In hindsight, everything was clear and is clearly there, which has a lot to do with biases in organizations and organizational blindness on certain aspects of capability sets.
I read about one project that was budgeted for 5 million and in the end cost 200 million and set in motion the bankruptcy of the entire firm. How can a project get from 5 to 200 without somebody along the way saying this, stop?
I think this is psychology. Yeah, a lot about what we are talking here has to do with psychology. Yeah, it's an optimism bias that you find in a lot of projects and project plans that actually permeates into the project's execution. Yeah, so it's basically the effect that if you look at something and it gets a little better, yeah. And this kind of derail and never stopping projects normally have to do with steering bodies that have an optimism bias, that look at progress and see some progress in the way how projects are delivered. So to say, they see the light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel gets longer and longer, yeah, and they don't lose sight of the light, but they don't come through, yeah. And there is some organizations that don't have the capability, and in the end, to actually define the cutoff points for this kind of events, yeah, because they don't see it in the totality. Normally, they only see the next incremental step.
And an alternative explanation to that is, you could be very cynical about this and saying, isn't that those 5 millions that in your example they estimated in the beginning were never realistic anyway. So everybody knew right from the start that the project couldn't be delivered at that price point, yet maybe there was no more funding available. So everybody pretended that this would be feasible, and as soon as you get going, as Jürgen said, as in you show first incremental steps, it will be really hard for an organization to pull out again. We see very little projects getting abandoned, even if they escalate massively. So the tendency is to stick with them, and the psychology is to stick with them. And so you can also see is that not only as a result of optimism, but very sinister politics and organizations that are played to secure funding and start the project, because your chances are you won't be stopped.
Yeah, I think we called this the second bias. We called strategic misrepresentation. Yeah.
Mostly because, well, technically it's lying, but strategic misrepresentation sounds like a capability that you can become good at, even though you shouldn't.
I see. So that would call into question whether some of these projects are even over budget if everyone knew that the budget was deliberately understated.
Yeah, I think this is a fact that you not only see in IT projects. Actually, you see that in a lot of other projects as well. Yeah, that this kind of, it needs to fit into a budget, and we will see what happens when we are on the way, and we will free more money when we are on the way. I mean, this might be from a strategic or from a tactical, not from a strategic, but from a tactical point of view, this might sound okay, but the ripple effect that this has is that the planning is not done then in the right way. Yeah, because it doesn't stop at the tactical or at the decision, but it actually the plans need to represent the lower budget that is assigned to a project, and therefore you get a start on the wrong foot, even if everybody knows that the numbers are not right. As long as you don't adjust then the planning to what you believe is right, you will always run into trouble. Yeah, actually into more trouble than otherwise. Yeah.
And we also found that, I mean, there's the very simple steps that organizations and projects and individual project managers and decision makers can take to prevent against this. And the best analogy to describe them is probably if you were to remodel your kitchen, you could go to the kitchen studio and have the designer there design your kitchen, and they will quote you a price that you will find acceptable, and then later on they will come with a lot of changes and upgrades that will be added onto to the price point. Or the alternative approach is you basically go around your neighborhood and have a chat and a cup of tea or a cup of coffee with all your neighbors who have recently remodeled their kitchen and ask them what they actually paid in the end. And so what we see and with the IT projects, and what is really based on a great idea by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, that which they published in 1979 back then, is sort of the second approach. It often gives you a lot more accurate insight into what are the true costs of a project, and you can take this kind of political bias and also the optimism bias out of those estimates by simply asking the question, is then the last 20 people that wanted to do exactly this kind of projects or similar projects, sort of in what range were they at? And then you can clearly see is, and if everybody pays at least 200 million to implement a certain type of IT projects, is how on earth could you do that for 5? So you can actually get a lot more accuracy into these projects by taking an outside view and taking a sort of independent, data-driven view of, is your project the right size, the right length, and that in this way you can get the optimism out of it and also this political bias.
So we've been talking here about a major point in your research, which is the role of cognitive bias in project failure. One of the cognitive biases you mentioned in the paper was the idea of black swan denial. I'm wondering, can the black swan failure mode be detected that you're going toward that before it's eaten up 10 times or 100 times of its budget? And is the right thing to do to cancel those projects at a certain point?
So I think where we ended up with, there is no 100% way that you can actually detect black swan before it happens. What you can do is you can lower the probability for black swan to occur when you work on specific capability sets in an organization. Secondly, what you can do is you can actually detect a black swan when it has happened. So when the project has actually start to detect the degree of derail that will happen. Yeah, so you can actually detect and with the probability say this is a project that will lead to a catastrophic escalation curve. Yeah, again through the reference classes that we have built. But you can't actually prevent a black swan from happening, or you can't predict which of the projects actually will turn into a black swan. That is something that you can't do.
Yeah. And so, for instance, to give an example one of the patterns we found in the data is that there are some of these early warning signs that the project might be at a higher risk. So again, no certainty, but there's a higher risk that it might turn into a black swan. And one of those early warning signs is that the baseline shifts very early. So if a project goes into contracting and vendor selection, and suddenly the baseline needs to be adjusted upwards, that's a clear red flag right there for black swans. And then another one, for instance, is if the project manager and everybody associated with the project, including the vendor, is saying that the project is unique. And those two together actually are the two indicators for the worst case of black swans, the ones with the largest cost overruns and the biggest disruption they can cause for organizations.
Another question I have about black swans is if a project fails, the company may lose some money, and that happens, but the case where the entire company goes bankrupt is clearly it's important to avoid that case. Earlier, you said one of the failure risks is the transformative project. They're more likely to be a catastrophic failure when a company undertakes a transformative project. They bet the entire business and that goes out of control.
Yeah, there is definitely a higher risk, or there is a higher risk associated to transformative projects. Yeah, which has a lot to do not with technical delivery capabilities, but more with the change management that is involved, as well as with the ambiguity and uncertainty of requirements when you need to write, and when companies write requirements for a future mode of operations that is quite far departed from their current mode of operations. Yeah. I think that pair of facts, so the uncertainty in the requirement set and the change management challenge in transformative settings is something that gives you the higher risk quotient.
Yeah, so if the example that you're referring to is I think the one company that we described now in one of our articles, which was Carglass, an automobile glass manufacturer and repair facility here in the UK. And they had a struggling ERP implementation that was delayed, which then led to a loss of their inventory. So they suddenly lost the visibility of the inventory, which, and the company was in a difficult financial position. It pushed them over the edge. And the same thing, sort of this disruption of operations happened in other things as well. So when Levi Strauss was implementing their new ERP system, they did everything by the book to de-risk it. So they developed their global blueprint, they rolled it out in Europe and Asia first, and then they wanted to come to the US, and as a risk mitigation measure, because they thought it might disrupt their operations, they even shipped a full quarter worth of sales ahead of the switchover. Yet, when it actually happened, it took all the distribution centers in the US offline for about 2 weeks, which cost them all the quarterly profit and made, I think, if I remember correctly, a 24% dent in their annual profits. So a massive impact on the operations there, with then the resulting financial consequences. And then if you're in a Carglass or like Kmart, so when that was still around, where again, 2 successive, very expensive ERP projects that cost a lot more money, that come a lot later than planned, already impact a company that is already squeezed and in a financially difficult position, it can really push it over the edge. And then you see these things that you can even bring whole companies down by failing IT projects.
So Alex, how would you advise a company facing the need to replace their inventory system to proceed in such a way as to manage risk to the business?
I think we see basically 2 strategies of what can be done. And the first one is you can predict and provide, and the second one is predict and prevent. Predict and provide means you have to understand and have a realistic, meaning non-optimistic assessment of what the risks of implementing a transformative project truly are. So, and then you can provide for that. And the provision means that you need to create the flexibility, and that is often in terms of schedule buffer and cost contingencies, to be able to deal with these not unexpected changes, but with the problems that are eventually going to arise, the turbulences that every IT project gets into. The second strategy is the predict and prevent, and that is to say, what is your actual risk exposure of the project? Again, it starts with a view of realism, but then it begins at building some of those capabilities that are able to decrease the likelihood of, for instance, black swan events, so actually start to de-risk your projects.
I would add a third category to that, and that is actually going one step further than just de-risking one project. It's actually understanding not just the characteristics of your project that you have and match that profile against success and failure levers. But it's rather looking at the overall capability set of the organization to deliver a portfolio of IT projects, because that organization or that portfolio comes with a specific distribution of risk factors, as we have seen in a couple of cases. So you can actually institutionally start to address your capability profile and increase the awareness of that, and train your people on the tailing dimensions of the main levers to pull to deliver projects on time and budget.
What do you think about the proposition that companies should be quicker to cancel projects that are not fitting within those ranges or parameters that they've established?
Yeah, I mean, what you mentioned, I think, is something that organizations need to learn. Actually, read the indicators in the right way and not perpetuate an optimism bias in the way how they govern and steer projects. Yeah, so. I think with the escalation curves that we have seen, there are clear indications when actually it would be better to not necessarily terminate a project, but actually put it to a restart. Yeah, so basically reboot, I would say, because in a lot of cases, the project or the cause for initiating this kind of projects has not gone away. Yeah. So you need, as an organization, you need to run something that delivers this kind of capability with the reboot instead of with the stopping, yeah? And then with setting up the costs associated with that are higher.
Okay. Another area I want to explore, we have focused a lot of our shows on the Agile movement and Agile processes, which have become popular in a large part in response to the failure of very large, heavily planned projects by breaking things up into smaller pieces and trying to deliver incremental value. Have you seen any impact of Agile concepts on these large IT projects, or perhaps they just don't apply?
Yeah. So the first question that I would have is, Agile projects by nature are smaller projects. Yeah. So with that, it's fine. But smaller projects still have the same, and from our observation, have still the same kind of probability for success or probability for failure. I think what is interesting is how you actually measure overruns, be it costs or be it schedule, in agile settings. Yeah, because agile in itself is something that is floating somehow. Yeah? The budgeting processes in organizations that are really agile is different. Yeah. So I would say we definitely have a challenge in measuring and in comparing it against normal waterfall-based projects. Where it gets interesting, and I think where it gets comparable again, is when you go to agile at scale. Yeah, so scaled projects where the book that you are following has actually a lot of different chapters, and where the chapters need to fit to each other. Yeah. To make sense out of the story. I think that is something that can be compared directly, because there you don't have a floating baseline. Yeah? When we, but Alex, please comment on the statistical validity of this, because when we last looked at it, I think we didn't have enough pure agile projects in the database to come up with really meaningful results.
We do have, yes, we don't have that many agile projects at scale, and because there's just not that many out there. But so what we can see from our data, at least, is that that agile projects have a better schedule performance. So the schedule overruns, if you compare agile against waterfall, those go down by factor 2. Cost overruns are similar. The risk of black swans is very similar from agile projects and other compared to waterfall projects. And I know it's very, very difficult, and it's still very early days for Agile to really draw a conclusive picture. And a colleague of ours, Jeffrey Pinto, has recently done a survey on the success and the failure of Agile, and he came to a very similar conclusion, as in that big IT projects or transformative IT projects struggle and fail, not necessarily because they had the wrong methodology. So it is never about the process chart or the process handbook. At the same time, Agile is doing a lot of things right, and it's a good step in the right direction, particularly in terms of managing interdependencies, of engaging the users, of engaging the stakeholders. So it offers some interesting ideas, and we see that it might make a difference in some ways, but not in all ways.
Right. Yes, exactly. It just goes into the pipeline and it gets prioritized somewhere.
Yeah, again, I would argue that one needs to look very carefully on what is the effect of the floating baseline that actually comes with the agile methodology. Yeah, because I think a lot of the overruns, at least the smaller overruns that you actually see in normal, is that you don't have this kind of floating baseline. Yeah, that you don't do the adjustments on scope creep or on additional scope whilst you go, but you need to rebudget. Where in an agile project, it's no issue at all when you out of a sudden need to add 2 more features or 3 more features. Yeah, it's not even recognized. Yeah. I think there we need to look, and there is lots of research that is necessary at that stage to make actually the different project methodologies really comparable, and to distinguish and at least filter out the effect that comes through this kind of floating baseline phenomenon on Agile.
Yeah. At the same time, we also see there's a lot of optimism, again, like in all projects with Agile, for instance. So looking at some of those cases where Agile wasn't very successful, it really raises the question, so for instance, what should be your minimum viable product? Should it be sort of the easiest case that you have to handle in your system? And then you say, well, okay, once we manage to implement that, then we can get more complex. Or should you, for instance, start with the most complicated case, with the most complicated product, the most complicated client that your system needs to be able to handle? So, and I think there is some of those things, and there's great optimism around Agile. It is not, as Jürgen said, it is not the solution if there's a lot of things that can go wrong. It doesn't solve all these problems.
Yeah, and I think it points, what you just say, Alex, points in also a very interesting direction, which actually focuses, for Agile, we need to focus much more on the outcome, and not on the administrative side of projects, with judging whether an Agile project is successful or not. Time and cost overrun are not really the criteria, but it's really the outcome, and with that, the accuracy in which you actually have defined your requirements, even in the Agile world, So the minimal viable product is I think, a good indicator for that, So
we're getting close to the end of our time here. I'd like you each to talk about where listeners might go to learn more about this topic or about your work generally. Alex?
We have published a series of articles and working papers, and they are all on our website of the Sa&iuml Business School, and they're freely accessible as well through SSRN and Archive.
Great. And Jürgen?
We have published some of that in our McKinsey on business technologies, as well as in the McKinsey Quarterly, which are also accessible over our website. And in case of any questions, or in case of wanting to run this kind of diagnostics that we have talked about, this is definitely a service that we actually offer jointly, and whoever is interested in that can contact either Alex or myself.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for speaking to Software Engineering Radio. And for the listeners, we would love to get your feedback. You can email us, team@se-radio.net, direct message us on Twitter @SERadio, or find our group on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Google+. For Software Engineering Radio, this has been Robert Blumen.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more information about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can write comments on each episode on the website or write a review on iTunes. Mention or message us on Twitter @SERadio, or search for the Software Engineering Radio group on LinkedIn, Google+, or Facebook. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under the Creative Commons 2.5 license. Thanks again for your support.